Okay, welcome students. This video is going to introduce our next section, which is on absolute value. You can see here we're going to be solving equations with absolute values. And this, if you look at this equation right here, you can see this is a little bit different from what we're used to. What you see inside here, these two lines right here, these two lines represent absolute value, and so what's in here is eventually the equation that we're going to be trying to solve. So that's basically what an absolute value equation looks like. So what is absolute value? The best way to answer this is just to simply look at a number line, and you know that I like the number line. Okay, so here's just a number line. Let's say we've got 0 in the middle, and on this side we know we have the positive numbers, and on this side we have the negative numbers, and we're going to be looking at 5 and a positive 5. Okay, so they're kind of opposite positions on the number line. So in essence, what absolute value is, it's the distance a number is away from 0. Now if you're going to measure a board, say our board is 9 feet long, it doesn't matter if you measure the board from right to left or left to right, how long it is still 9 feet. So the same way with this on the number line. Okay, from 0 to 5 is still 5. From 0 to a negative 5 is still 5. And so when you deal with absolute value, what you're dealing with is the distance from 0. In essence, that distance is always positive. And it's a little bit more trickier than that when it comes to solving equations. Now, if I take a look at the absolute value of 5, it's 5. If I take the absolute value of a negative 5, it's also 5. So if I want to take a look at the absolute value of x, and the absolute value of x has to be 5, there's actually 2 equations I need to solve for. Let me move this up just a little bit. And the idea is that if you're going to solve an equation for absolute value, you drop the absolute value sign. You have a negative side of the absolute value, and then you have a positive side of the absolute value. So that's how we get our 2 answers. And again, this is just kind of a really basic thing, and when we get up here and we'll solve problems 1 and 2, you'll see how it all works. Okay, so let's go ahead and clear this, and I know I have some notes for you later on the board that will go through all the steps of this. So the first thing that you have to do when you're solving an absolute value is you have to isolate the absolute value. Okay, so the isolate means I have to get this piece right here all by itself. Now on these first equations, that's already done for you. You don't need to isolate anything. So all you need to do is just kind of drop those and then go ahead and solve it. I'm going to erase this right now. So anyway, so once the absolute value is isolated, you want to drop the absolute value. You're going to drop the absolute value symbols. And then this third step is you're going to write 2 equations. And just like in an absolute value, you're going to have one answer that's going to come from the negative side of the absolute value. You'll have another answer that comes from the positive side of the absolute value, just like on the 2 places on the number line. So you're going to have a negative equation. And I'm not saying the answer to this is going to be negative. It's going to come from the negative part of the absolute value, and you'll see here in just a minute. So positive equation. So you're always going to have 2. So now, so it's already isolated. We know the absolute value has to equal 10. We're going to drop the absolute value, and then we're going to write our 2 equations. Okay, so next thing we have to do is we have to write these 2 equations that have to do with the negative side and the positive side, just like we had a -5 and a +5. So we're going to drop the absolute value on this, and I get x plus 12 is equal to 10, but I'm going to change this to a -10, so I take into account the negative side of the absolute value, and then over here I'll have x plus 12 equals a +10. So to distinguish between the negative side of the absolute value and the positive side, if we want the negative side, this number here is going to be negative. We want the positive side, this number here is going to be positive. Now, you can have 2 answers that'll both end up to be negative values for x, so don't get that confused with the negative and positive side. That's an entirely different story, and it comes from a different place in the algebra. Okay, let's go ahead and solve these. I want to get the 12 to go to 0. It's a +12, so I'll put it with a -12, and I'll do the -12 here. Rules of integer algebra says if they're the same side and I know I'm adding or subtracting, I'm going to add the 2 together and keep the sign, so that'll be a -22. So my first solution is x equals a -22. So that's the negative side of the absolute value. Now we'll do the positive side. So I have x. So I have x plus 12 equals a +10. I'll do the -12. -12. That goes to 0. So the integer math here says I have 2 different signs. Take the bigger number, subtract a smaller. So 12 minus 10 is 2. That will be a -2. So those are my 2 answers for the absolute value. And you can see that neither one of them are positive, but this is the negative part of the absolute value because that number on the right-hand side is negative. This one's positive. Okay, so now the next step I want to do is those are my solutions. I want to check them. And you really should do this. It's a must-do. If you don't want to, that's up to you, but when you miss them on your quizzes and so forth, or your assessments, it's going to be kind of sad. You must do this. Because sometimes you can get an answer that doesn't work, which is kind of strange because we don't have that very often. Or anyway, we haven't. Okay, so here's my original equation, so I'm going to check it. I'm going to take the absolute value of a -22 plus 12 has to be equal to 10. Now these 2 numbers here are going to be different numbers. We're going to call this number 1 and this number 2. So -22 plus 12 gives me a -10. The absolute value of a -10, its distance away from 0. So now these 2 10s, they're different 10s. This comes from one place, this comes from a different place. They work out, so the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side, so that checks out. Now we'll do the other side of the absolute value. So I will have a -2 plus 12 equals 10. Now again, these 2 numbers, this is a 10 that's going to come from this place. This 10 comes from this place. They're 2 different 10s. So -2 plus 12 is absolute value of 10 is 10. So absolute value of 10 is 10. So that checks out. So that's a basic idea how you do the absolute values, and we'll do a couple of more problems that are a little bit harder than this, so you can see kind of how the isolation works and how we do some of these other harder problems. So, okay, and this problem is number 19 on our worksheet. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this down and we'll get this started. Now, if you took notes on that first section, you know the first thing that we have to do with this absolute value is we have to isolate this. This thing needs to be all by itself right here. So I have to get rid of this -2. So I'm going to divide it out to both sides. If I divide it here, I have to divide it here. So this is kind of like our variable in a way, isn't it? It's like this has one gigantic x here, even though there's an x on the inside. So kind of think about it that way. Now this goes to 1. So that means the absolute value is all by itself now. And I know a negative divided by a negative, that's going to be a positive, and 64 divided by 2 will give me 32. So that is a positive 32. Now that my absolute value is all by itself, I can drop it. I like to do the negative side first. So the negative side of the absolute value, then the positive side of the absolute value. We basically already have the positive side right here because this number here is positive. So negative 4x minus 2 equals 32. So there's that side. Over here is the negative side, so I'm going to change that to a negative 32. The inside stays the same. I just drop the absolute values. Okay, here we go. These equations will be pretty easy to solve. I'll add 2 to each side. That goes to 0. The bigger subtract the smaller will give me a 30. It keeps the sign of the bigger. So now this survives, a negative 4x equals a negative 30. I'll divide each side by the negative 4 to get this to be 1x. So x equals a negative 30 over negative 4, and if I simplify that, that's going to be 15 over 2. So that's the answer to that negative side of the absolute value. And I probably won't go ahead and check these even though I should. I'm just running out of time. So now I'm going to do this one. I'll add 2 to each side. That goes to 0. These are the same signs, so I add them and keep the sign. That'll be a positive 34. So negative 4x equals 34. Divide by a negative 4. So I end up getting x equals 17 over 2, and negative 17, because that number is positive. There's our video for this, and we'll be covering this today, and thank you for watching.